Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ASMEA Conference. I am Asaf Ramarowski. I'm the Executive Director of ASMEA, and it really is my pleasure to formally welcome you all to this year's conference. This is the first roundtable of the conference, and this has been really one of my great pleasures and honors to do this for the past 5 years. Thank you. We inaugurated the Fouad Ajami Roundtable, one of the founding fathers of the association at large, and together with Michelle, we have put together not only ongoing, really a legacy and a memory to Fouad and his work, but a lot of the disciples who have followed his work and continue to do the great work that Fouad laid the groundwork for him, and in conjunction, Professor Bernard Lewis, that started the association at large, as we all know. This afternoon we have really the great privilege and honor to have a phenomenal panel of disciples of Fouad, and there's a lot to tackle, I would argue, for sure, as we know the Middle East and the ever-changing daily since October 7th. But we have this afternoon to many issues to tackle, which I think will be a fascinating way to capture Fouad and the work that he did in the continuation of his disciples. So I will, to my left, Michelle Ajami. No need for introduction, who Michelle is. And next to Michelle is Reuel Gerecht. Reuel is a former CIA expert, intelligence officer who dealt a great deal with Iran, has written a great deal on the Iranian Revolution. He is currently a resident scholar at FDD. He will tackle the Iranian aspect. Next to him is Professor Al-Azm. Amir is a professor of Middle East history in Ohio. He is taught at Georgetown. He's also taught at the Qatari campus of Georgetown in Gulf Studies. Al-Azm is been a prolific, keen advisor on Syria and particularly on the Middle East at large. He focuses on the threats of cultural heritage in the areas of conflict, looting, and trafficking in cultural property and antiquities. A lot to discuss there in the area of Syria for sure, and he will talk about those aspects. Last but not least, my colleague and friend Lee Smith, who's been a long-time veteran journalist covering the Middle East at large. Lee has been writing for decades on these topics. He writes for Tablet Magazine. One of his well-known recommended books to read is known The Strong Horse, Power, Politics, and the Clash of Arab Civilizations. Of late, he's been tackling a lot about issues in D.C. regarding China and the current administration, and so there's definitely a lot to tackle at large. So really, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who will take it from the panel, take it from there, and will moderate this panel. I will also be remiss if I did not mention this is also the first year that we are privileged and honored to inaugurate the Fouad Ajami Prize. As many of you know, we've had for the past few years a prize honoring Professor Bernard Lewis. This year we're also going to be honoring Professor Fouad Ajami, and there will be winners of those prizes tomorrow night at the prize ceremony, and that's all part of the larger issue and the larger effort that we've made to make sure that both founding fathers of the association are properly honored in the proper way. So without further ado, Michelle, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Asaf, and it's really lovely to be here. I always enjoy being in such a friendly group. Bernie, hi. And I'm so grateful to the three panelists that we have today. Grateful for their expertise and their scholarship and their relationship to Fouad as well. I want to start with Lee, having just read your wonderful piece on It's All About China, or not. And I'm just going to pose a few questions in the beginning and let you guys take it away. I'm not going to moderate too much, if at all. We know that Albert Colby has been one of the ones in the administration formulating a strategy that sees the defense of Taiwan and preparedness for that as the single most important focus of this administration, perhaps the sole focus. And Lee has made clear that the Middle East and Iran in particular are equally important as a region that impacts the viability of the Chinese threat. As he wrote, Iran is vital to China's anti-U.S. strategy for the Middle East, where the goal is to minimize American power in a strategically vital part of the world. He's traced the source of materials for drone parts discovered after October 7th to U.S.-made components bought by Chinese entities and passed on to Iran and Hamas. So my question to you for a discussion is Colby's focus wrong-headed? Where does the administration stand on all this? Where should the administration stand on all this? And I'm gonna throw out a lot of questions and then let you guys take over. So you have to remember my question. For Reuel, I'm very grateful. He's pinch hitting very suddenly today, and I'm so grateful to have him here for his immense knowledge of the social and political and cultural aspects of Iran.
My dearest sympathies if you came here expecting Masih, because she's incomparably more fun than I am. So.
That's true, but you've written a string of Wall Street Journal articles recently that have clarified the obscure maneuverings in Tehran. And I think my main question for you is, what does a post-Khamenei Iran look like? He's 86 now. Has he established enough of a system that will endure? Back in '88, Fouad wrote in The Impossible Revolution, in the behavior of its custodians can be discerned both the zeal and audacity of revolutionary politics and the wily resourcefulness for which Iranian society has long been known, and a kind of cunning. And where is that line between revolutionary ideological passions and naked power? Is Iran a large crime syndicate stretching all the way to Venezuela, or is it something more ideological? How important is the regime's strength? To the regime's strength are its proxies. Do the Ayatollahs recognize a kind of fragility in their structure that leads them to go after their own population and people like Masih? And Amr Al-Azm, Sadiq Al-Azm was one of Fouad's great inspirations, maybe the first great inspiration for the Arab predicament even. Such a great mind. And Amr has been to Syria several times now since things have changed. And I wanted most of all to focus on Ashara, what your impressions of him are. Is he the Islamist Ataturk that some people think he's intending to be? What kind of relationship with Israel will he establish for Syria? And just to end on a note about Sadiq, Dr. Sadiq, who was, as I said, one of Fouad's heroes. Fouad described him as a political heretic. And in a more recent introduction to the self-criticism after the defeat, he said, Al-Azm sought to strip Arab thought of its belief in fate and folktales and superstition. Much like Fouad's own autobiography, When Magic Failed, I think the connection there is the same. The magic failed, and what do you move on to in the Arab world? And what gave Sadiq's book its power was the theme of responsibility. Al-Azm had for the Arabs the gift of his clarity, as I think these three panelists do as well. They were his people, his descent, a true act of fidelity. I think when Fouad wrote that, he could have written it also about himself. And I think that's what I'm looking for from these gentlemen here, and I think you will get that as well. So I'm going to leave it to them.
Michelle, you asked me first. I'll start, and I'll try to help lead into Reuel and Amr as well. Well, the first thing I wanted to say is, Michelle, Asaf, thank you so much for inviting me, but especially Michelle, thank you so much for inviting me. And Fouad was such. I would like to say that I was a disciple, but of course I never took a class or anything. As a writer, he was so important to me because of his style, his prose style. And as a thinker, I often think about how he would think about stuff. How would he see things unfolding in the Middle East, in the world, in the Trump administration? It's always a question in my mind, which I asked Tony Badran, and Tony will be here and joining us later tomorrow. What do you think Fouad would think of Trump? And what do you think Fouad would think of Trump administration policies? So I think about him all the time because also it's not just his clarity, it's his sense of humor and the way that he would put things as well. And that was so important to me, getting to know him, his warmth and his sense of humor and his ability to phrase different issues and different problems. I'm giggling because, again, just thinking, as I think he had just such a tremendous wit and ability to put things in a perfect way. So also he's very important to me as a writer. He's one of two writers, Angelo Codevilla and Fouad Ajami, are two people that I think of all the time as someone I try to think, how would they put this? How would they say this? How would they think about this? So I'm so honored that you've asked me to be a part of this roundtable to commemorate him. So thank you so much. Yeah.
One of the ones that he was most proud of in publishing in the working group series.
That's very nice.
Very much so.
So I don't know, we of course don't know how Fouad would think about the Trump administration, but you asked about China. Here's how I see it. I think the Trump administration, the president, sees China as the #1 issue. And the article that you're talking about, I referred to the China axis. I think that Donald Trump understands the world basically in Cold War terms because we're basically in the middle of a Cold War now where we have a giant power, and that giant power is China, and it's a threat at home and abroad. And that threat will include everything from Taiwan. I think that Pentagon people or people who talk about Taiwan as being, the most daunting threat, I think it's not. I think it's very bad, the idea that the U.S. position in the Indo-Pacific is likely to collapse if the first island chain is overrun. That's a really bad thing, but that's a subset of a bigger problem for the Donald Trump administration, for Donald Trump, for the president. He talks about tariffs, he talks about the trade deficit, because without this, the Chinese wouldn't be a threat to Taiwan. That's what, and Trump talks about this all the time, that our trade deficit, certainly since China's accession to the WTO in 2001, is worth many trillions of dollars. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, would not be the threat it is were it not for that. China's tech sector, including its ambitious AI programs, would not rival America's if it wasn't for the money that we were paying them. So it's a very large issue, and it includes its allies, like Russia, like Iran. So that's why I think it's important for people when we talk about other aspects of foreign policy to think of what Trump's ultimate audience is in terms of foreign policy, and that's in Beijing, right? Whether he's talking about Putin, I don't think the meeting with Putin is going to come off. I don't think we're going to do this, but I'm still going to meet Xi. Certainly Iran. Donald Trump has talked about taking care of Iran's nuclear weapons program for ages, since well before his first campaign. So the idea, there's a lot of anti-Trump. A lot of Trump critics, both on the left and behind his back, who are really trying to hurt the administration in lots of different ways. He's being led around the nose by Netanyahu and the Zionists. No, this has been very important to Donald Trump for a long time because Donald Trump sees the fundamental issue with the Iranians in the Persian Gulf. But it's not just the Persian Gulf also. It's the Houthis in the Red Sea, and it's Hamas and Hezbollah in the Eastern Mediterranean. And what does that mean? If you look at a map, if you go back to what geopolitics is and you look at a map, you're like, oh, wait a second. If the Iranians are allowed to get away with covering all of these strategic waterways, that's bad for the United States. It's bad for trade. It's bad because of the amount of energy that comes through that part of the world. And the way that Trump understands that is it's not just in terms of Iran, it's in terms of China too. So you've heard lots of people here in Washington talk about, oh, the Qataris have such a terrible influence. The Qataris are paying for this, the Qataris are paying for that, and they're undermining Trump, and they pay for Republicans, and they pay for the left. From my perspective, Qatar is a troublemaker in lots of different ways, but Qatar cannot afford to have the United States pushed out of the Middle East because from Doha's perspective, they use us to balance off the Iranians. So for me, the problem is China. China is the world power that gains most if the United States' position in the Middle East, especially in those bodies of water, is weakened. And that's how the Trump administration sees it too. And that's why right now the Trump administration, I shouldn't say the Trump administration, because this is one administration, I think more clearly than any other, that it's not, well, there are multiple centers of power. There might be people who think they have power, and you'll see different fights going on, reported in the papers. But finally, when it comes down to it, the decision maker is Donald Trump. Right? He delegates an awful lot of power, but it's really Donald Trump. So it's really Donald Trump's vision. And again, Donald Trump's vision, it's China in the center of it. So when he's talking about like the Gaza peace plan, the Gaza ceasefire, however you want to talk about it, the reason it's so important, it's important for lots of, for some people it's important because it means Israel won. For other people it's important because it means Israel lost. For Donald Trump, it's important because it's supposed to get Israel and Gaza off the front pages, right? People talk all the time about how what China wants is they want a lot of chaff. They want the United States. They want Donald Trump occupied with anything but China, right? They don't want him dealing with China, and they figure wherever else they can cause problems, whether that's Central Europe, whether that's the Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf. That should also be named the American Gulf, by the way, in addition to the Gulf of Mexico. So we have two American Gulfs, one, all the way on the other side of the world. This is why that's important to Donald Trump. And if you look at what... Again, because we have a problem right now in Washington, and many of you are seeing it, and you're aware of it, and we can talk about that later if it's of interest, though I'm sure tomorrow in another panel I'll be on with my colleagues from Tablet, we'll be talking about the Jew obsession now on the right. But this is a lot of what you're hearing, and so people are happy to hear about Trump beating up Bibi. Trump has, whether you like it or not, Donald Trump regards Benjamin Netanyahu, because he says it in public, as a great hero, a great war hero, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Israeli leaders ever. So Donald Trump loves Bibi Netanyahu because he talks about it, right? But he also wants all that off the front pages so he can focus on China. So I think I'll just leave it at that and to leave you with the message that the way he sees the Middle East, it's very important for a number of different reasons. Trade, energy, all these different things. But it's also, he sees Iran as a function of the China axis. And the China axis is the thing that he's worried about, that this is the cornerstone of his legacy. So he's been talking about China even before he was talking about Iran. Though he talked about Iran a lot too. In the 90s, he was saying, yeah, it'd be terrible if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. The Iranians, the Iraqis, all these things are bad. These people cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. So he understands that, he appreciates that, but again, it's all in line with the China axis.
I don't know if I need this or it works. I think it works. I'm not sure I believe in a China policy for the Trump administration, and for the same reason I'm not sure I believed in a China policy for the Biden administration, and that is American defense expenditures don't match American responsibility. So the U.S. Navy ought to be growing substantially right now. It's not. I would expect the U.S. Navy actually to be cut further. I just don't see a terribly forceful American foreign policy vis-a-vis China. Unless you see increased defense spending, we're not going to see it. I'm not a very big fan of tariffs. I hope the Supreme Court knocks them down in a variety of ways, but and I don't necessarily see the tariff struggle that the Trump administration is undertaking with China is going to produce an American victory. But and I'm uncertain of how the president views China. He has a lot of different contradictory actions, and it's unclear to me that he views China as strategically as was just suggested by Lee. Maybe, but it's certainly it's not clear to me. And I would say the same thing about Iran. I mean, Donald Trump's defining moment, I would argue, in the Persian Gulf in the first administration, where he refused to respond to the attacks at Gerecht and Horais, which sort of shocked everyone in the region. Now, and even on his best moment, which I would say is when he droned to death Qasem Soleimani, it wasn't 100% clear that he was going to do that. I mean, John Bolton had asked him to do it a couple times, and each time John asked the president to do it, the president responded, "That would be too provocative, and you're just too hawkish." And then, of course, John leaves and he goes around and does it. So I'm just saying there's a certain presidential whimsy here that defies policy, established policy. So I do think the President of the United States has a certain ill will towards the Islamic Republic, well-founded. It certainly started after the American hostages were seized, if you go back and you look at his somewhat erratic commentary. And I think that has stayed true. It wasn't, I would argue, a foregone conclusion that the United States was going to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. I think it's probably accurate to say that I've been recommending bombing Iran's nuclear facilities longer than anyone else I know in Washington. And I had more or less stopped discussing the issue because it had not appeared that the president was going to do that. And it's an open question whether the president would have done that if the Israeli response to Iran in the 12-day war hadn't been so overwhelming. And if the Israeli response and actions since October 7th, particularly in Lebanon, hadn't been so successful. It's not clear to me that Donald Trump would have actually done anything. Maybe, maybe not. But and I would say to the president's credit, it's very difficult to imagine anyone else actually doing it. It took someone like Donald Trump to do that because of his, I don't know, the left would say hard power, roguish possibilities. And it proved, I think, fairly successful. And to segue that perhaps into Khamenei, the supreme leader, it did him obviously enormous damage, as did the Israelis even more profoundly. And I don't think he recovers from that. He certainly physically and mentally doesn't seem to have recovered from it. What had been an absolutely brilliant foreign policy, sort of imperialism on the cheap, which had been working, the proxy strategy, the slow approach to the nuclear weapons, et cetera, I think had worked extremely well for Iran and allowed it to have much more influence in the region than its actual hard power merited. But what had seemed a brilliant policy went up in smoke quite quickly once the Israelis actually started to mow the lawn again, something that they had forgotten to do for several years. And it wasn't uncommon if you met Israeli officials before they unleashed against the Hezbollah. It wasn't uncommon to speak to Israeli officials, Israeli military men, who expressed great anxiety about the missile stockpiles in Lebanon. That the Israelis were, at least some Israelis, were effectively checking themselves. I actually believe Bibi Netanyahu was one of those individuals. Bibi's bark is was always worse than his bite. And I think October the 7th reshuffled the deck entirely. So the Israelis were prepared to do things that they weren't prepared to do before. Now on the succession, I mean, Khamenei is obviously in a bad way. He didn't cover himself in glory. For those of you who follow Iran, you probably are already aware that, you started seeing Revolutionary Guard Corps commentary that was getting pretty severe for the Islamic Republic, questioning his judgment, his decisions, certainly the decision to go slow on the nuclear question. Now, that doesn't mean that these individuals actually in the past disagreed vehemently with the Supreme Leader. It just means that they've jumped ship now. And I think the Supreme Leaders, whatever his choices were, and they certainly I don't believe were clear, whatever his choices were for the succession, I think they probably more or less evaporated now. And there were just reports the other day from Mossad's X site, talking about Revolutionary Guard Corps, senior Revolutionary Guard Corps who work in the Supreme Leader's office, sort of going on their own way. I don't know if that's true. I think we need to see a little bit more information, but it's entirely possible. It makes sense that the Supreme Leader's awe, and I use that word precisely, his hebat, has been so badly damaged that I don't think you have, the notion that people would quickly genuflect, if that's the wrong word, I suppose, in his direction, it's just no longer guaranteed. So I don't think this necessarily means that we're going to see a fundamental change in the Islamic Republic if the Supreme Leader has the decency to die in the not-too-distant future. I suspect the theocracy will hold in some capacity. I think they can pick a new Supreme Leader. He may not be have the stature of Khamenei, but we have to remember that Khamenei didn't have initially very much stature either. But I think the system can hold. It may not. I mean, I always remember there was a wonderful book written, co-edited actually by a very good friend of mine, Bernard Houcade, at CNRS in Paris. I think the book came out in 1988, stressing my memory. And the title of it was Tehran au-dessus du volcan, Tehran on top of a volcano, which is a good image to have of the volatility, the potential volatility in the Islamic Republic, that it is fundamentally an unstable regime. The problem is the regime knows that. So it compensates. It is well aware of how many people in Iran do not like the theocracy, do not now even like the Islamic Republic, and are quite prepared to engage in nostalgia, and they do it all the time. And that nostalgia doesn't go back to the early Islamic Republic, but actually goes back to the Pahlavi dynasty. That doesn't mean that Reza Pahlavi, who I still reflexively refer to as Baby Shah, because I remember him actually in a bar in Williams College. And it's hard for me to get that image out of my mind, actually. So it's hard for me to refer to him as, what do you call him, the Crown Prince? I mean, whatever. That doesn't mean that he's going to have a big future inside of Iran. He probably won't. But it's not to say that he doesn't benefit from great nostalgia. If the regime if Khamenei dies and you start seeing turbulence within the first 6 months after his death, then things could get really interesting in the Islamic Republic. Again, I don't think it's likely because I think the Revolutionary Guard Corps in particular and the Basij below it are invested in the regime. And many of them really do still believe in the revolution. They are fully invested in the revolution. And they are certainly fully invested in their own self-interest, and they know damn well that if things start to crack, there's no place for them to go. That their people aren't going to kiss and make up. They're not going to have the equivalent of South Africa. That isn't at all a likely scenario, and they're not going to believe it. And we have just witnessed with the Women, Life, Freedom movement when it was crushed, and it has been effectively crushed, that they did that through a variety of means, some of them quite cruel. And I don't believe a regime that is capable of shooting, beating, and poisoning young women and girls is going down easily. And we've seen that in other demonstrations, but I think it was most poignant, you might say, dealing with the women's movement. Because many members in the ruling elite had daughters who had expressed or were expressing support for the Women, Life, Freedom movement. And I think that it caused a great deal of internal debate. I wouldn't go so far as to say convulsions, but certainly anxiety that was easily observable about what to do because they were scared of coming down too forcefully against women. Because the real truth is if they came down too forcefully against women, they feared the possibility that young men would take to the streets in numbers. And the regime fears numbers. It can handle small demonstrations. And the Women, Life, Freedom movement never got beyond really small demonstrations outside of the ethnic areas. And as we all should know, the Iranians and the Azeris, who are the two indispensable pillars of the Islamic Republic, can thump on the minorities all day long, day after day after day after day. It doesn't matter how many Arabs or Baluch or Kurds go down. What matters is how many Iranians, Persians, and Azeri Turks go down. Insofar, those two groups have held, more or less. They have not been willing to go to the streets in great numbers, certainly not the numbers that we saw in 2009 with the Green Movement. So I think the regime believes that it can handle the situation that is coming at them. I think they're nervous about it, but and certainly the possibilities for internal disagreement when the supreme leader dies are fairly large. But again, I think there is sufficient regime cohesion in unity, largely because they know whom to hate. They can agree on that common denominator, that they'll probably hold. Was there another question?
No, but I wanted to follow up a little bit. Do you think then that Iran is going to double down on everything and become more like Syria under Assad, when they no longer have the raison d'etre, the raison d'état of Sid Zainab, or being the protectors of the Shia throughout the Middle East, when they no longer have that legitimacy? Where do they get their legitimacy when all the proxies have fallen, and they can't claim that as a reason for doing?
No, it's a very good question, because it was certainly evident when the Iranians fully committed themselves into Syria during the Civil War. It was evident that many members of the Guard Corps actually got their sense of legitimacy from the combat in Syria. And they got the sense of legitimacy that here, at least, we were fighting the good fight. Back home, we've got issues with our own people. So robbing them of that success is significant. Now, I do believe that ultimately it's about a domestic question, and that is maintaining the Islamic Republic, maintaining Iran, at least in their own mind, as being the vanguard of, of the way the Islamic world should work, and being the vanguard still against the intrusion of the West, and particularly the United States, though Israel, the little Satan, has grown a bit in their calculations. The Iranians in the past, and I would argue, tried to always view the Israelis as a subset of the United States. They still do, but that they didn't like talking about the Israeli threat as much because it's demeaning. It's much easier to talk about the United States as a serious threat. That's far less demeaning. But Israel is again, I changed this equation and changed the lexicon a bit. So I still think they're going to get a sense of legitimacy in opposing the United States, opposing Israel. But it's much more difficult. And the nuclear program has been seriously set back. And that gave the Iranians a certain sense of purpose, a certain frisson, you might say. It's going to take them a long time, I would argue, to recover from it. Just the purges they have to go through are going to, consume at least, I would argue, 12 months to 2 years. And they're good at purges, by the way. I've seen them purge people in the past, and they're fairly thorough. I mean, I don't want to talk too much out of school here, but I mean, I've seen them take down intelligence networks before, and they do a pretty good job. They usually, for every real agent they take down, they tend to take down like another 10. I suspect of that 10, 5 are just misses, and 5 are people they just want to get rid of. So they're going to go through that same process now. So all of these things, are going to cause turbulence, if not convulsions, within the system. So it's going to take them a long time. But I mean, searching for legitimacy is going to be a problem for them. I think they can find it, but I think the diet will not be nearly as satisfying as it has been in the past, and I don't think they get to replicate the proxy networks. If I were the Iranians, I would worry all the time about Iraq, because I think it's always been incorrect to view Iraq as a satrapy of the Islamic Republic, and I think this Iraqi independence resistance to the Iranians is only going one way. It's increasing, and it will continue to increase, I would argue.
Thank you so much. And I think Syria is off the table in a way it wasn't. It hasn't been for a long time, and that's where you take over. Here.
Yeah, that's better. I have to agree with what you were saying initially about the Trump administration. I see less of a actual, long-term strategic thinking here and more of a transactional opportunist sort of approach to a lot of these issues. And I say that because you also mentioned the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, and I think that was very important because for me, that was the beginning of the chain reaction that brought us to where we are today, certainly not just for Syria, but for the region as a whole. I would argue that Qasem Soleimani had a very unique sort of hold on all these proxies that you were talking about that were so fundamental in and successfully so for so long. I mean, I know during the Obama administration period and afterwards, even into the first Trump and even into the Biden administration, there was always this, that Iran was way bigger, way stronger, way more dangerous, way more so on and so forth. But killing Qasem Soleimani, I think, ultimately is what allowed Sinwar off the leash. That's what I personally think. I would argue that it allowed Sinwar off the leash long enough to be able to launch his actions on October 7th. And in that then sets off the chain reaction response that ultimately leads to the destruction of Hezbollah and the diminishing of Iran's influence in the region, which in turn obviously then presents the opportunity for a counter-offensive against Assad and the remnants. And remember, the Assad regime by that time, by the end of 2024, was really very much sort of a hollowed out shell anyway, and propped up primarily by the Russians and the Iranian-backed sort of, Hezbollah and other Shiite military sort of elements that were there. But in terms of itself as a regime, so when that falls apart, then it was just inevitable. It just kind of rolls off, and of course I'm simplifying it a little here, but ultimately that's why the regime ultimately fell. So what happened on December 8th was and that's the night that Assad fled the country, is a coalition of different factions, including HTS, and even HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is a coalition. Now, why am I telling you this? Because when you look at Syria today, you see Shara in charge, you see sort of structures of supposedly there's a government, a functioning government in charge. But this is eggshell. This is, cigarette, what we call in Arabic, the thickness of a cigarette paper. Really, you're still in the factional phase. What you see in Syria today is a factional state. Well, I wouldn't even take back the word state. You see factionalism, fasailiyya in Arabic, and a mindset that's still holding of ghanaimiyya, fasailiyya and ghanaimiyya. Ghanaimiyya from ghanima, which means basically spoils of war. These guys are still in that phase. And if you want to understand what's going on in Syria today, you have to also recognize that they have not yet been able to transition from this factional state to an actual, or condition to an actual institutionalized functioning state. So I went down to Syria about 6 days, I think 5 or 6 days after the collapse of the regime in December 2024. And it was quite a journey. We had to fly to Beirut. We had to walk across the borders because cars weren't being allowed through. And it was kind of that post-apocalyptic landscape where just burnt out cars and buildings and, all the way down from the Lebanese border to Damascus. And it was kind of interesting back then because everything was possible, everything was open. You could literally walk up to the presidential palace, which is up this steep, long road that leads to the top of the mountain, where Assad had built this monstrosity of a structure overlooking the city. And you drove up there, you went up there, and you'd see people camping in the grounds. You'd walk into the building itself, and just rooms that are empty, people hanging out, kids playing football at one point. in the hallways. And you just walk in and you walk into one of the rooms, you might find Shara sitting there, and or Al-Jolani, as back then he was known. And you could meet with him if you wanted to. I chose personally not to for several reasons, but it was a very kind of open thing. And his people, the different factions, the leaders, were also very open and willing to meet. I mean, I remember the first night we arrived there, we went out to dinner. I was with a couple of friends of mine, and Dalati, who was the number 2 in Ahrar al-Sham, one of the core elements of HTS, because HTS itself, even Shara's own HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is made up of 5 or 6 factions, which includes a breakaway group of Ahrar al-Sham, includes the Zinki, includes Jaish I can't remember what they're called, So it's all sort of groups that are come together. And I remember asking Dalati at the dinner, I was like, so how is your relationship with, Shara as Ahrar al-Sham? And he went, oh yeah, we're great. We're doing great with Abu Jouj. I was like, who's Abu Jouj? He said, oh, this is our Dala, our nickname for Jolani. I said, what, you call Jolani, you have nicknames for each other? And then with the same breath, and this is why I'm telling you this, with the same breath, he says, but there is 1,700 martyrs between us. 1,700 shaheed. Referring back to the 70-day war. So they haven't forgotten. So fast forward 10 months on. What's the glue that's holding these factions together? And will it hold? Will it continue to hold? Shara is definitely in charge. But if I could simplify this, and I know there are people, if there are cultural anthropologists in the room, please, be patient with me. I'm only doing this because, in the very traditional sort of what we call political sort of organization, from a cultural sort of anthropological, the 4 stages of band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. And the most unstable, according to Morton Friedman, was the chiefdom phase, because it's neither a tribe nor a state. It's kind of the in-between. And so a chiefdom has to, basically a chief amongst the different tribes rises above all the others, unites the tribe. So you think of the Zulu, Shaka Zulu, you think of Muhammad uniting the tribes, you think of Tugrul Bey of the Seljuks uniting the tribes, you think of Osman Bey uniting. So the history is full of these cases. But how many of those actually succeed beyond the first or second generation and continue into a fully functional? Very few, because it is in its very nature unstable. Right now, just change tribe to factions. So Shara unites the factions. Can he hold that unity? How long can he? What's the glue that's holding them together? And what will happen, more critically, if it starts to kind of disintegrate? So the question is, where's Syria at now today in terms of how well this glue is holding together? And will it sort of, and what are the, let's say, spoilers or potentials for that potential disintegration should it come? Remember, Shara is again, highly opportunistic and very pragmatic. We've all seen that. We understand that. I've heard people say that no one who's ever met him left the room unhappy. He always somehow makes sure that, you hear what you want to hear. And that could be a good thing. You could argue that this is a skill that he has, but also it could be, not something so, in the real world, when you're really having to deal with real issues, this will only get you so far. And after a while, you have to start to deliver on some of those promises you're making. And that could be a problem in its own right. But So Sharia, being what he is, has succeeded so far in getting it. But how does he then get these factions to transition from a factional state into an actual institutionalized state? And that's going to require two things. It's going to require security stability, but it's also going to require economic stability. And those two, in my opinion, are also linked to transitional justice and civil peace. And so far, none of these issues have really been addressed in any meaningful way in Syria. There's no security. I mean, okay, if you come to visit Damascus and where I live in the middle of Damascus, yeah, it's a bubble. But you venture out a little further and you get to see something else. It's still very dangerous. It's very unstable. It's very, unsettled. Economically speaking, we keep hearing about all these fantastic promises of huge funds. My daughter was here in DC, I think last week, and there was talk of, for the, she works for a hedge fund, and there was talk of basically possibility, an interest in investing in Syria. I think the Syrian Minister of Finance was here as well, Sha'ar, and he was talking about that, and everybody was getting excited, and the Qataris apparently are going to guarantee whatever loans or bonds that are going to be debts that are going to be sold. The Saudis are promising huge sums of money. Yes, I'm sure, but this is so far. This is all on paper. How much of this is actually translated into actual money, cash flow on the ground that the state can use, the state's institutions can use to start paying salaries? You want to take these factions and incorporate them into an army. Sure, you can go to the faction leader and say, and they say, okay, your faction is no longer going to be a faction. Now you're going to become part of the army, and now your men are going to become part of the army. Yeah, but you have to pay them salaries. If you don't have the salaries to pay, then the factions, will not give up. And then the elephants in the room. To the east, you have the Kurds and the SDF. To the south, you have the Druze. And on the coast, you have the Alawite sort of community, and also what's left of the regime's kind of leftovers. And I want to stop just and say one quick word about the Alawites and the leftovers of the regime. When the regime collapsed on December 8th, the regime had really three main battle formations that actually amounted to anything. The 4th Division, the Tiger Brigade, Suhail Hassan's, and the what we call the Presidential Guard. Okay, and altogether I would estimate around 45,000 men. Those three formations, there was no epic battle in which these forces were decimated, and then the remnants kind of dispersed or crept away. No, literally, people went to bed, they existed, woke up in the morning, and they completely disintegrated. They just disappeared. We say in Arabic, "Fass malih udab." Literally like a cube, a cube of salt that just sort of, it's gone. And it did just with a lot of their heavy weapons. And that went back to the mountains. That's all up there. Plus, I would argue that since 2005, after the Hariri assassination and the debacle with the Lebanese and being forced to retreat, a lot of Alawites became very concerned about the stability of the regime and the ability of Bashar al-Assad and his clique to take this through. And I know from personal experience, people I personally know who literally started leaving and heading back to their villages, leaving Damascus, leaving the cities, leaving their jobs, retiring or just resigning, and taking their families back and preparing for the end of days. And they called it the end of days. And the date they had set was 2010. So they were out by 1 year. But already, there's a huge amount of weapons stockpiled in those mountains. And a reservoir, a human reservoir, that could regroup if the right time came. So, and I think, the events in late February, March that happened on the coast kind of were a herald of what could possibly happen, and the reaction of the current administration was very unfortunate and very ill managed. And I will explain very briefly why it ended up like that. But at the same time, a lot of people were hoping, well, we hope they learned their lesson. We hope they won't do that mistake again. And of course, we quickly found out that no, they're going to keep doing it. They did it again in Sahmaya and in Jaramana. These are two suburbs of Damascus. And then again, they repeated the same mistake in Sueda. So now you start to ask yourself, what's going on? Are these guys, stupid? Are they doing it on purpose? Is this the only way they know how to? And I would explain it very briefly, and I'm going to stop there. I'd explain it very briefly. First of all, I would argue that this administration has a limited set of MOs to use. It would like to think that it has other options, but when it comes to actually doing something, they just follow the same. They use the same MOs they used in Idlib, because it's the same guys who basically took over the Idlib region and crushed all the other groups, and they're using the same tactics, which I think is part of what's happening. The second thing to bear in mind is the following: what resources does the current administration have at its disposal to actually do what it wants to do when it has to fight? At HTS, the very core of HTS probably is around 12,000 men, give or take, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, of which I'd say about a quarter maybe are foreign jihadi type. This is like, and Sharia is saving those. He will not use these. These are for when and if things go bad and everything falls apart. We say in Arabic, "Tufrat al-masbaha," the prayer bead, the pearls. It was in English we say, yes, the string of pearls sort of breaks, and then everything goes. Then that's going to be his. That's going to be what's going to save him, protect him. So he's saving that, and then the other sort of fighting or security element is the newly formed Am, the newly formed security formation. But they're green, they're inexperienced. Literally, I've talked to some of these guys and we've done some interviews with them. They get 2 weeks of what they call Dawra Shar'iyya. They just get two weeks of here's how you read the Quran and memorize these whatever and a little bit of here and there, and that's it, and they get sent out. Some of these guys don't even know how to load a gun. They've never held one. And then they get sent out. They got sent to the coast, they got slaughtered. They got sent to Jaramana, they got slaughtered. They got sent down to Sueda, they got slaughtered. And of course, when that happens, you get this sort of automatic overreaction, and the only fighting elements left are the factions. And those factions are ill-disciplined. They don't take orders. They just sort of go in and then you see the results of this ill-disciplined, uncoordinated attack. Where you in the coastal area, when we interviewed some of the people in the aftermath, they would say we'd have one formation come in and they'd be okay, and then 2 hours later another formation would come in and they'd round up like half the men and kill them for no reason, or they start, then another formation come in and they don't want the men, they don't want them, they just want to take, they just want to loot. It's just looting, ghanaim, war prizes. And I think with this kind of lack of coordination, lack of institutionalism, real institutional functioning elements, with a lack of economic stability. I would say that if you ask me right now, what are the chances of whatever's there now staying together and the glue that's holding these factions together to continue to do so, I'd give it a 60-40 against in the next 12 months. We'll see. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
You're generous.
I'm giving it 60-40 against. It's succeeding.
Yeah, no, I would make it worse.
You make it even worse. All right. Well, listen. I have to go back to Syria in December. I'd like them to let me back in.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
On the Lebanese, the Hezbollah sometimes gives the impression that they live in fear of the Sunni Syrian factions and the foreign holy warriors just coming over the border for a little revenge. Do you think on the Syrian side that's a credible concern on the part of Hezbollah?
Well, let me put it this way to you. If you were let's not even say Hezbollah, if you're a Shiite, let's just leave it at Shiite, and you live across the border from, let's say, the coastal region, because remember, it's sort of Homs cuts into northern Lebanon, and then from there you have Trablus, Tripoli, and then you're onto the coastal region. So if you're in that area and you're Shiite, and you're looking down, and you just saw what happened in the coast, and then you saw what happened in Sweda, and you'd be thinking, you know what, if for some reason these guys end up coming over, they're not disciplined, I could get slaughtered. Now, is that a real, is it going to happen? Is there a real chance that these guys are going to come over from the other side and start killing them? I don't know. But from an existential kind of visceral gut feeling, that's how they're going to feel. And I would say on the Syrian administration side, they haven't done much to disabuse them of that. I mean, and separate the language from the actual, actions on the ground. Actions on the ground don't speak well. And I would tell you, 1 week after I went down to Damascus, so this is literally, I'd say, maybe 9 days after the fall of the regime, I had the opportunity to go down and meet Al-Hajari in Sweda with two of my colleagues. And the night before, we got a call at 11 o'clock, and we were asked to come and see the head of security for the southern region, a guy called Abu al-Bara, I think it was. And they'd heard that we were going to go down, and they said, look, we know you're going to go down and talk to him, and we want you to make sure he hears what we think. And, we have a message for him, just make sure. And what he said to us was basically, look, we know that Hajari is coordinating with the Israelis. And my colleague who was Druze, who was, organizing this trip for us, said, no, I don't think so. It's impossible. I know Hajari really well. He would never do that. No, he's a Rajul Watani, he's a guy, no. And anyway, so we went down the next day, and we had a meeting with Hajari, and it was just literally, I'd never met him before. It was the three of us, plus Hajari, plus one of his people. And it lasted for almost 2 hours. And we were having this discussion, and he was clearly, I mean, he was very welcoming, obviously, and all that, but he was clearly very agitated in that. And I bring him up because that's another minority in the same way that if you're thinking of Hezbollah, these are another. He was like, these guys are not going to do good for us. We've got to have alternative arrangements. And we were trying to say, like, well, we don't know. It's like it's just early days. And in the end, Hajari said, listen, if I don't get what I want, I have a secessionist agenda. He said that to my face. He said, I have it. This was 8 days, maybe 9 days into the fall of the regime. We hadn't seen anything. You know, literally, you could walk up to you could drive up the presidential road to the palace and walk in and just have tea with Sharia if you wanted, on your own, like that. And the guy was saying, so I think those fears are deep set, they're there. They drive a lot of how people are reacting. And I think in Lebanon, I was talking to some Lebanese friends of mine, I think there is no will, and I know there are plenty more people who know more about this and could say more on this, but just from what I'm hearing, I think there is no will in Lebanon to start another civil war. So I don't think that the army or even I don't think they're going to go and disarm Hezbollah. And I don't think Hezbollah are going to give up their arms. And I think the net result is that the Israelis are going to continue to hit those areas, and they're going to turn the south into a wasteland, a depopulated buffer zone, if you will. And that's their answer to, that's their sort of, yeah.